Well, as you know, I don't normally get out of bed much before 1800. So my focus is going to be very much looking at the question that was posed, the challenges which the Reformation poses for us today. And I'm going to do this in a twofold way. First of all, by looking at the challenges which it poses in the outside world, by which I mean the world outside the churches. And secondly, I'm going to look more specifically at the challenges that it poses for people who are operating within the perspective of the Church of England. So I'm very interested in David Gearing's point about the sharpening of religious ideologies since 2001. And obviously that is true in Britain as well. But I think the story of the Reformation and Protestantism is not one that has become sharpened actually in that period since 2001. I think it's other types of religious ideologies which have emerged in a sharper way. It strikes me actually that in the outside world these days one rarely bumps in to the Protestant Reformation. And I think that's because the generation of people who were educated or indoctrinated, depending on which word one wants to choose, with a Protestant, nonconformist perspective on the world is essentially a generation that's passing. Many of those, however, who were born in the 20th century did have that experience of being shaped by the free churches and a Protestant evangelical view, and sometimes also, of course, that being a perspective that came from the Church of England. Anybody who learnt to read on this island in the period from the late 50s to probably around 1980, which is of course a lot of us in this room today, almost certainly read Ladybird books. Am I right? And the Ladybird books, as you may remember, had a history series. Most of those were written by the most influential historian of whom you have never heard, Laurence duGarde, who wrote on a whole variety of topics, and in doing so created a Protestant history for children to absorb as they learnt to read. So the titles included Elizabeth I, Cromwell, David Livingstone, John Wesley. I could go on. I have wondered if there had been a title in the series called, for example, Erasmus, Humanist and European, how different things might have turned out. But I am actually quite serious in terms of wanting to point to the influence which that culture, Ladybird books of course were very inexpensive. The idea was that one's parents might purchase one every week, drop it into the shopping. That culture of introducing, shall we say, children into British history and its heroes and some heroines. Florence Nightingale featured in the series as well, as I recall, and Elizabeth Fry, had a significant impact. And then, of course, also that generation of people who have now also passed into the grave, people of the generation of Tony Benn, a very prominent Labour politician, whose mother was, in fact, the founding president of the Congregational Federation, Margaret Wedgwood Benn, and quite a significant theologian in her own right. And obviously that influence, that Protestant influence on Tony Benn was very, very marked. And as he moved through life, he moved into a position of a kind of very small c Christian agnosticism. If I think of my own father's generation, and Ben and my father would have been the same generation, it's really quite significant that my father is a man who thought his way, had a Methodist childhood, but thought his way out of religion probably by the time he was in the sixth form, and had committed himself to a rationalist and scientific outlook on life, actually was able to access the English nonconformist tradition when he was organising my mother's funeral, and wanted to have a rewritten feminist version of He Who Would Valiant Be sung at her funeral. Then, of course, there is the, if I can be very contemporary, the Brexit conundrum, and a very interesting piece of research that has emerged just in the last few weeks from Linda Woodhead at the University of Lancaster, which shows, apparently, that members of the Church of England were apparently more likely to vote for Brexit in the referendum, sorry, it's a bit of a slip, in the referendum of June 2016, and that Roman Catholics, unsurprisingly, were more likely to vote Remain, and the hierarchy of the Church of England was more likely to vote Remain. So that, I haven't managed to explore this research much further than what I've heard reported in the media, but I think this is an interesting line of inquiry. The Reformation, of course, was the first time that we tried to leave Europe. So that's the world outside. Thinking about the Church of England, and I'll do this perhaps a little more briefly, the point I really want to make, I think, is that the Church of England is still, to some extent at least, looking at the Reformation through the lens of the 19th century and through the 19th century church parties. The Oxford movement, of course, which emerges from the 1830s and is an open repudiation of the Reformation, emerges from within the Church of England, within the University of Oxford, openly repudiating the Reformation and promoting all sorts of views which were hostile to it, not just as a religious phenomenon, but also seeing it as a socio-economic and a socio-economic disaster as well as a religious one. So the most famous quotation from the Oxford movement on the subject of the Reformation would be Hurrell Froude's much quoted observation that the Reformation was a limb badly set that needed to be broken again in order to be righted. And also, of course, that sense, and this is a view which one still hears expressed in some places, including some places quite close to this one, that the Reformation unleashed a form of rationalism that was ultimately very destructive of Orthodox Christianity. So the fact that the Oxford movement has, in a whole variety of ways and different levels, actually shaped the way in which the Church of England is today, I think means that there is quite a complicated process of unpicking that needs to be done as we look through the 19th century lens. And then at the other end of the theological spectrum within the Church of England, there are, of course, the self-consciously Protestant movements that were set up initially to oppose the Oxford movement. So the Protestant Association, the Church Association, the Protestant Truth Society, organisations that were intended to defend the Protestant principles of the Reformation within the Church of England. And for this group, their heroes were people like Bishop J.C. Ryle, the first and overtly Protestant Bishop of Liverpool, and people like William Joyce and Hicks, who defended the prayer book in 1928 against revisions that would have taken it in a more Catholic direction. And that tradition within the Church of England still exists in the form of the Church Society, who see themselves as upholding the principles of the Reformation in what they would see as a timeless and unchanging way.